Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for a practical guide to business intelligence governance, presented by Data Leaders Brief and sponsored by Metric Insights. I'm Revon, the webinar coordinator of Data Leaders Brief, and I'm so excited to bring you guys this fresh session on implementing effective BI governance. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Marius Moscovici and Mike Smithman in what I'm sure will be a fascinating and amusing conversation. As a reminder, we are recording today's session just in case you guys have to leave early. If you happen to miss any part of today's webinar, you guys can go to the registration page to access the recording within 48 hours. We're going to go ahead and send that webinar link to the chat box right now. Up next, before we go any further, I do want to thank Metric Insights for sponsoring this session and helping us to make it happen. Metric Insights Enterprise Business Intelligence Portal is the leading BI governance platform that integrates all your BI tools, reporting, and metrics into a single consolidated catalog of governed BI assets. Metric Insights drives engagement with BI, making it simple and practical for users to find, trust, and consume data. Thanks again, Metric Insights. Up next, next up here, let's go ahead and get some technical things out the way. Please feel free to ask questions throughout today's session. You can do so by submitting them into the questions panel on the right side of your screen. Great questions make for a great webinar, so don't forget to stick around for our Q&A session to get even more fresh insights from Marius and Mike. My wonderful colleague Stephanie will be fielding your questions today. She'll be happy to answer anything you might have. So pull up the questions panel and say hello to let her know that you're listening. Lastly, if you have any audio issues during today's presentation, you may choose to dial in by phone. You can do so by selecting the More button in the upper right portion of your screen and then select the Switch to Phone option. Up next, today we'll be hearing from Marius Moscovici and Mike Smithman. Marius has over 20 years of experience in analytics and data warehousing. He is the CEO of Metric Insights, the leading provider of a BI portal that helps organizations organize their BI environments. Mike has over 15 years of product and marketing experience in the business intelligence industry. He helped bring analytic products to market with senior roles at Seagate Software, AIM Technology, T-Leaf, Acero, and Good Data. And with that introduction, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to you, Marius, and let's go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're delighted that we were able to participate in this and to have you here with us. Today we're going to talk about BI governance, and before we kind of get into it and get into the details, I want to just level set for maybe some of those in the audience that aren't really familiar with what BI governance is all about. And I think a lot of us familiar, of course, with data governance, and we know about that. Every organization has a data governance team, making sure that data is properly classified, that PII data is flagged, that we know what data sets are certified. All those key functions are taken care of by that team. But really, if you think about how the information is consumed, that effort of data governance is really only half of the picture. And you've got this other very important puzzle piece around analytics governance that is often overlooked, right? I mean, think about it. Your users, 99.9% of the consumers of the information, are not accessing that data raw. They're not going to the table. They are consuming content that has been created by analysts for them. So they're using anything from traditional BI tools like Tableau or Power BI to spreadsheets, maybe that report that goes out every month from finance to all of the leaders telling them how things are performing, to maybe things like data science assets that are created, things written in Python and various things that where somebody's consuming that analysis and looking at it. And so if you've stopped with governing just at the data level and what's the point, right? I mean, how much utility is there in knowing that a particular table contains PI data if the consumer of that content, when they're looking at it through a dashboard, is not aware of that, right? What's the point of knowing that data set's certified if somebody who's looking at a data science or a spreadsheet that's based on that information is not aware of the fact that this is in fact built off of certified content? So today we're going to focus quite heavily on the analytics governance aspect, and of course how it ties in with data governance, but we'll look at BI governance more holistically and really focus on specifically on the analytics aspect, because that's the part that often gets overlooked and is one of the reasons why a lot of governance initiatives tend to fail. So sort of taking a broad perspective here and thinking about BI governance, just at a high level, there are really three different pieces, three different gears that have to turn together in unison in order to make governance work effectively. You've got to have the right people filling the right roles. You've got to have a process that those people are going to follow and that they're willing to follow from a governance perspective, established and that is being adhered to. And then equally important, you've got to have technology that meshes with those with the people and with the process, so that they can execute on that process in a way that's efficient and that allows them to continue and sustain that effort. And so like with anything, but particularly with this kind of governance initiatives, you've got to think about all three of these gears, how they fit together and how they mesh and work in unison to make something work. And so we'll be spending a bit of time in this presentation talking a little bit more about each of those. So with that, let's start by talking about the people, right? And so if you think about roles and responsibilities around governance, I would maintain that there's really three big classes of roles and responsibilities, right? There's a business owner. So these are the folks in the organization that are doing things like coming up with definitions for things, identifying, what are the rules of the road that you're going to be following, and they're not technical necessarily, but they are going to be key in establishing the right guide rails to work with. Then you've got your BI analysts that are responsible for taking those definitions and is making sure that that implementing the right business logic so that those analytics, whether they be a spreadsheet or a BI asset like a Tableau dashboard or a data science asset, that it implements the business logics appropriately. Right? And then finally, you've got data stewards, and they are responsible for making sure that the data is good. And this is more, they typically tend to focus more on the data governance part of the BI governance puzzle. And there they're looking at onboarding the right data, certifying the right data, and making sure that there's data quality in place, right? Making sure the validation's in place, such that that when somebody's looking at data that it's not accurate and that it's in fact current, right? And so let's look kind of just as a quick example of how these three roles interact together in for particular analytics. So imagine for a moment that you've got like a sales operations dashboard, and this is something that all of your sales team are using to be able to understand, how are they selling, how are they tracking against their sales target, performing, and what's their, how are they reaching their quota, are they not, and so on and so forth, right? So using it for sales management. So in this kind of a attainment dashboard for sales, each of these different parties has the following roles, right? A business owner would be the group that would be defining, what is the attainment calculation? How do we measure? What are the goals set to? Where do the goals come from? And when you look at goals, what kind of sales count towards that goals? Is it just new sales, or is it sales into existing customers? All of the SKUs included. Are there different kinds of multipliers? What's the territory that's applicable? How do we determine that? And how are exceptions managed? So all of those things that the rules that need to then be understood in order to calculate something as simple as attainment would have to be there and would have to be defined by the business owner. And then the BI analyst has to take all that information and make sure that the dashboard that's created, or whatever calculations are generated, all adhere to that information. So they go and they build tables and charts and design a dashboard or build an asset in some other tool, and they adhere to the business rules that have been created and laid out by the business owner. And then finally, the data steward in this puzzle is responsible for the data aspect of it, right? So they're responsible for basically saying, yes, this data is coming from the right place. Maybe they're forming the Salesforce queries that are going to feed the dashboard, or if the data is coming, let's say, from Salesforce into your data warehouse, they're responsible for the data pipelining and making sure that the data is actually all transferred from the source, that the right rules are applied to make sure that it is consistent and accurate. Any kind of data cleanup is performed, transformation rules are applied properly, and that any kind of validation is performed so that when the business is looking at the information, that they know that it's accurate. So you can see how these three pieces kind of in a practical level on this simple example all have to fit together. All these three roles have to work together in order to make this particular simple sales attainment dashboard work, right? So if we shift our gears from the persona area and talk about process for a moment, there's a very common mistake, a pitfall, I guess you could call it, that I just see over and over again when people attempt BI governance. And I want to sort of address that sort of head on, because it's literally the most common thing that people do, and it always leads to failure. And it's very well intentioned, right? It's kind of what I call the kind of the Goldilocks approach to BI governance. And that they say, well, I know that governance is sort of can feel like an onerous task, right? Nobody really, apart from the folks that are in the governance team, it's often hard to get people excited about governance, right? They just feel like, oh, that's this thing I have to do. Um, and so like and yet it's necessary, right? We can't get away without governance because we have the regulatory compliance requirements, we have data literacy requirements, we want to make sure that we're delivering correct information to users. So what ends up happening is people say, well, I want this governance to be kind of, not the whole Goldilocks thing, not too hot, not too cold, just right. So I'm gonna kind of triangulate. We're not going to use a very extensive, heavy process because no one's going to have adherence to that. But no process is no good because then we have no governance. So let me kind of triangulate and find something in the middle and call that the sweet spot and apply that as my governance process across the board. And this seems like, on the face of it, seems like, oh, it's not a bad idea. But in fact, it doesn't work at all, right? And to understand why it doesn't work, imagine for a moment, take it out of the data realm for a moment, and imagine for a moment that you're opening up a men's clothing store. Right now, men, I don't know if all men are like me, but if you're like me, men don't really like buying clothing. Suits, you have to go buy a suit. It's a pain in the butt. But let's say you have to do that. So your men's clothing store wants to make it really easy for men to buy clothing, and since they don't like the whole process of getting fitted and on all that, want to make that process as streamlined as quick as possible, you would say, well, okay, I'm just gonna take the average size suit and I'm gonna give that size suit to everyone that walks in the door. Really save them time. A single process is just going to apply to everyone, and it's going to be great, right? Obviously, that's absurd, right? I mean, nobody would do that. You'd have customers walking out the door looking like this. You'd be out of business overnight, right? What I'm suggesting makes no sense at all. And yet, as obvious as that is in that case, if you think about analytics and the governance of processes, is really the same idea, in that every piece of analytic you have in your enterprise, it has to be fitted to the process properly, right? You can't just take a single view. Otherwise, you get sort of this sort of experience, that's going to happen to your governance process, right? And so, what does that mean? You can do different ways to sort of fit the governance to the asset. There are various ways to do this, and here's one way to think of it, right? And one way would be to take your asset and basically put it on a grid, where across the top you classify the asset based on audience size. Is it something that is just going to reach one person? Is it something that's going to reach a small maybe business unit, or is it wide scale, like everybody in a particular business unit is going, all your tellers in your bank are going to be using this asset, or it's got something really, it's got a very broad audience size, right? And then on the other axis, think about, what's the business impact? So, and specifically, I guess there's kind of two ways to think about this. If the data is incorrect, or if the data is misinterpreted in this asset, how much impact is it going to have if one individual misinterprets it? Is it a small amount of impact? Are there other sources that people use for this information where they'll immediately notice that something is out of whack and they'll self-correct? Or is it a high level of impact? Is it something that, hey, this is financial reporting that's going to our board and our executives, and it's being and if it's wrong, it's going to cause a huge impact. We might be making strategic decisions incorrectly, and not only that, but the reputational impact on the BI team of getting this wrong is just massive, right? They're not going to trust us at all going forward, right? So those, classifying the impact and classifying that based on that, then you can then use this to determine what you're going to do. So for example, maybe something that is a low business impact and has a small audience, maybe an analytic that's just going to a single analyst who's just going in there and looking at it and maybe looking at network traffic or something like that. Not a big impact if it's incorrect on a particular day or misinterpreted. Well, that's just going to have the BI analyst being responsible for the entire governance process for that, because anything more than that would just feel like overkill. It's unnecessary. Maybe something that has, medium impact and medium audience size. perhaps like that example that I gave you of the sales attainment, where sales reps are using it to understand how they're doing against goal. So there's obviously some there's a large audience, all the sales reps in your organization. It has medium impact because if I it certainly have reputational impact if I'm not giving you the right information. It's going to be used for compensation, but they're not making they're so there's impact there. Then you'd have the business owner and the BI analyst working together to be able to make sure that the content is governed properly. And then something with a large impact, a high and a large audience. Obviously, you need to make sure the data stewards involved, other folks are involved, so that you've got the full community of people in the governance process focused on making sure that asset is continuously accurate and correct, right? And then you could fill out the rest of the grid as is appropriate to you. And the point is, I mean, this is an example grid. You could use different criteria, but the key takeaway here is that you want to have a very deliberate process through which you're assigning the right resources to the asset based on the nature of the asset, rather than just willy-nilly kind of following the same one-size-fits-all approach to everything. And then the process, when you look at what happens in that process, we also want to have kind of a fitted process for this. So here as well, it needs to be customized. So when you bring in content, obviously you need to do a few things, right? You want to be able to make sure you're tracking data quality alerts, you're adding data classification information, extending metadata, things like, what is this internal use only data, is it confidential, things that you want to be able to bubble up to the BI tool. You want to add documentation in some case, usage guides, various forms of documentation there. You may have glossary terms that you want to tag content with, things like to know that, hey, this is measuring churn. Here's what definition of churn is. Here's how we for purpose of this, so I understand what I'm looking at. And then certification, right? The idea that once I've gone and added all the metadata and reviewed it against other assets that are out there to make sure that the numbers all match up, somebody's putting a stamp on it and saying, yes, I stand behind this asset. It is correct. The rest of the organization can count on it. Right? That's a really critical part of governance, and that would be part of the stage. And then the idea is that obviously, based on the kinds of asset you're working at, the process by role is going to be different. So in that one case where it's just a single, just the analyst using it, analyst is going to be doing all of this. Maybe looking to see, do I need a data quality alert? Do I need to certify? They'll make decisions on all this, and they'll be responsible for every step of the publishing process and for making sure that the asset is published on their own. For other cases where maybe it's the example business owners participating, there maybe the analyst is responsible for the first stage of the process. They'll need to make sure that if there's any alerts that they're set up, classification and documentation. But then when it comes to tagging things with business glossary and certifying, well, the business owner is responsible for that, because we want a second party that's responsible to say, oh yes, this data is actually good and it's tagged with the right definitions that the business agrees to, and it can be certified. And then of course, in the case of those high impact, high or big audience type of assets, you might have all three parties involved. You might have the data steward responsible for making sure that to say, yes, the right data quality alerts have been established, maybe doing some of the classification to identify what information is, what level of sensitivity of the data is there, other kinds of classification, categorization information. Maybe the analyst is now only responsible for adding additional supplementary documentation, and the business is responsible for doing glossary and certifying content. And again, your organization might have something different mappings, different steps, but the point is that in your journey, as you think about how do you do governance, you want to be thinking mindfully about who are the different roles, and then mapping those roles to the different assets, and then mapping them also to the process that you're going to use to actually onboard content for consumption by your users. So having, and the underpinning here is that there's going to be a governed space, right? It's not going to be people just wandering around. All this is going to be the process by which content gets put into this governed space for consumption by the broad community of users. So, we talked about, as you saw in that process a moment ago, there's a lot of metadata that's coming in, right? The classification, categorization, glossary terms, etc. And when we think about that metadata, it's important to realize that it's not just coming from one place, right? Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. there's certain amount of metadata that's going to come from BI tools themselves, right? So you're going to know maybe the owner of that content, the link to the object, the name or description. So there's some things that should be bubbled up to the user directly from the BI tool. However, there are other things that maybe need to come from things like data catalogs. So you've got perhaps your governance team and your data steward are using a data catalog, Calibra, Elation, Purview, something else you've built internally, whatever that might be, and they're capturing classification. They're capturing information about for a particular visualization, what's the line of business that's using it, what's the level of sensitivity, et cetera, what tags are being used. Well, that ought to flow into the consumption model, right? For properly governed content, it is no use if this information is just sitting in your data catalog and no one on the business has access to it. You need to be able to bubble it up and take it to the point of consumption. So that's a point of metadata. That's that source of metadata that needs to be blended in with anything you have from the BI tool itself for the consumer of the user, for the consumer of the content. You might also have Excel source metadata. So this is very common. We see this in a lot of our customers. There's a certain the business itself is maintaining certain data, and that information is metadata, and that information is tracked for the different reporting objects. That metadata again needs to make it into the consumption so that anyone consuming it can benefit from it. And then finally, there may be content metadata that needs to be added at the point of publishing, whether that be additional documentation, or maybe you don't have a data catalog, so you need to set the data classification when an asset is published. So there is usually a class of metadata that has to be manually added when you onboard content if you haven't captured 100% of your metadata through either BI tools, data catalogs, or other sort of spreadsheets that feed the process. So the idea is, again, think about this as a mosaic where you need to think about all the metadata you want to give to your users to make that content well governed from a compliance perspective, and also easy to consume from a data literacy perspective, and make sure that you've identified how is that information going to get in, is it, and based on that source, have a process by which that gets integrated into the consuming experience. We also talked about certification. So that was the last stage in the process, as you remember, and that's the step by which somebody's taking accountability to say this content is good, the numbers are going to match other numbers that you're looking at. It is using certified data sources. If there's alerting required, data quality checks, those are in place, etc. And here as well, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, right? Because you might have, especially in a large enterprise with lots of content, you might have different tiers of certification. You might have a bronze level certification when the analysts themselves are involved in it by themselves and have certified something. You might have a silver level certification if there's multi-party, two parties, and a gold if all three are involved, right? So you can come up with different definitions here that let users know to what degree of process has this particular asset been put in through, and therefore they know how much trust they can put into this. And then equally important, what's the accountability? Who was involved in the certification process? When was the certification performed? Was this certified 3 years ago by somebody who no longer works in the company, or was it certified yesterday by the analyst who's the expert in this area? So understanding that around certification, critically important if you're going to have trust in the information that you're using. Right? And then looking kind of more broadly, once you've got assets out there, it can't be a publish and forget kind of model. It needs to all fit into a BI lifecycle, right? By which content is brought into the portal, and then over time it is evaluated and then eventually deprecated. And let me give you a sense of what this life cycle might look like. So initially, you may sort of synchronize assets and metadata like we talked about from BI tools into a centralized portal. So you're obviously going to need, it goes without saying again, you need some kind of a portal or entry point where you're going to have access to all this content that is governed, right? So bringing it all in, synchronizing the metadata, publishing the content that you do want to have out there once all the metadata has been added, so that through the process we just talked about, whether that metadata is coming from different sources, taking everything through a workflow, having it then now be certified and available to users to consume. So now the content is out there, but then the journey doesn't end there. The next step is really to have monitoring, right? If you're going to have governance, you can't have governance if you're not closing the loop, if you're not monitoring and saying, okay, we've deployed all these assets, but which of them are actually being used, and what's user activity, and are, you know, who's using what, and is there content that's no longer being used, or is everything continuously being used? Where am I being successful and where am I not? And similarly, collecting feedback, right? So it's one thing to know that users are going to a particular asset. It's another thing to know, are they happy with it? Are there specific things that they would like to change in it? Is it really like, oh, this gives me 95% of what I need, but geez, if we could add this other 5% in here, this would really be my go-to visualization for everything I need. So collecting this kind of qualitative feedback from users is critically important, and you need to have a mechanism for that, because, you know, let's face it, analysts are super busy. They're not going to be running SurveyMonkey surveys, right? It has to be all built into the consumption experience. And then based on that, based on usage, based on feedback, really having a mechanism by which you can update content and keep it fresh. So that involves change management, deprecating things that need to be removed, obviously adding things that need to be changed, adding change logs, documentation when things are changed, and then having an attestation process by which we know that content, especially really critical content, continues to be a good in a certified status, right? Because all assets have some kind of shelf life, right? It's something may be certified now, maybe you're using the right data source. 2 years from now, maybe there's a better data source for that. Maybe we've changed the business definition for what it means to count revenue, et cetera, right? So that asset may have drifted and may no longer merit that certified state, right? So having a mechanism by which you're continuously evaluating and attesting that in fact things are continue to be certified is very important to keep that governed environment fresh and relevant. And so, you know, when you think about that, right, that review and attestation process, again, just like the original certification process, is not a one size fits all. You probably want to create sort of a tiered approach to that, to say, well, again, those things that have broad reach and high impact, well, maybe those need to be attested to quarterly, because, you know, you want to make sure that every single time you publish those quarterly business review reports that your senior management's using, that absolutely nothing has changed, and that somebody's verified that all those key criteria have been met that was required for initial certification. Maybe other things that are less important you review annually, and maybe some things that are just used again by an individual analyst, very narrow reach, they're just responsible themselves to noticing if it's no good and removing it, and it doesn't require a process. So you know, again, fitting this makes sure that then you're not wasting time on attesting content that is really not doesn't require attestation, but at the same time you're not putting forward a process that's just insufficient for how important a particular asset is to your users and to the business, right? And then the final piece of the puzzle, the technology, right? Once you've got the people designated, you've got the right process, you really want to think about technology in a couple different ways. You want to have that governed space, of course, right? So a key silo here is to have a portal. So, you know, if you have 30 different places where you have to access the content, and you know, there's no way to govern it, right? It's impossible. So in order to have a governed space, you need to have a catalog or a portal or someplace where you can apply governance in a coherent way across all of your assets, whether they be everything from spreadsheets that are shared broadly, data science assets, you know, traditional BI tools, PDFs, whatever they might be, all kind of having it a single place where it's all accessible. You will need to have workflow capability, right? We talked about this. In order to onboard content, it can't just be drop it in and go. There needs to be a process by which you make sure that things are getting the right level of metadata, that they're certified when they're published, that there's the right level of governance applied to each piece of content based on the type of content that it is. And then you need to close the loop, right? So you're not done. Cannot be a publish and forget. That's not a governance model that ever works. You need to have a ongoing process by which you're measuring compliance and engagement. So you're looking at, you know, are people looking at their assets, and you know, are they clicking through from terms of service when they're things that are sensitive, and then for those things that they're using, you know, what are the things that need to be deprecated because they're no longer used? What are the things that need to be promoted because people are you know, should be using this more? And then, you know, where have we missed the mark entirely, right? We created this asset, but nobody's using it. Why they're not using it? What to do about it, right? So having all three silos in whatever technology solution you put in place, critically important, because they all have to work together to enable a solution. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Mike so he can give you a demo so you can kind of see how this works from a technology perspective. So can you switch over
Yeah,
to
we
Mike?
got it. Yes,
Oh,
thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Marius. So as Marius said, what I want to do is kind of bring this to real life a little bit. And obviously, I'm going to be showing you some stuff here in the Metric Insights platform, but really think beyond that and think about it in terms of however you implement this. Kind of what is the impact and benefit to end users of having a governed environment? We'll look at that. And then, what might the sort of workflows look like in order to create this environment for those users, and touching on sort of all the pieces that Marius just spoke about. So stage one, and as Marius just said, because BI exists in so many different tools now within organizations, I think this idea of sort of standardizing on one analytics tool and reporting tool has kind of gone out the window. There are many different sources of BI in an organization, some of which have governance capabilities in terms of being able to add metadata or certified content. Some which don't. If you're just pushing out Excel sheets or PDFs, there's not a lot of governance available on those assets. So having a single place to govern the assets and also giving users a single place to access assets is key. And we talk about it in terms of a portal, but one place to come and find and understand what the content is. And so what might that look like? Well, here you're looking at an example of what a catalog or library might be, where we're connecting to, again, all the sources of BI in our organization, whether that's sort of traditional BI tools like, say, a Tableau or a Power BI, or whether that's more sort of spreadsheet based, where we've got documents that we want to share with people, or even data sets or data science applications. We need this place to bring everything together, and each of these tiles that you're seeing here is where a published asset has landed into this catalog that we're referring to. And the benefit to the user is obviously they can get access to all this content in one place, but when they click on a particular asset, and we'll look at the publishing process in a minute, that should result in giving them the necessary context around that particular asset. So I just clicked on a Tableau workbook here. I can obviously see a preview image of what the workbook looks like. I can see the name. I can see a description. But I can see a whole bunch of metadata that is going to give me the context around what this report is actually meant to do and how I should be using it. And when Marius spoke about the metadata, again, some of this might be coming, in this case, from Tableau, so the name, the image, the description. Some of it might be coming from, say, your data catalog. So we're connected to Elation in our environment, and it's picking up classification of the content in terms of this is confidential. It contains PII data. We need to be careful with it. Some of it might be in terms of glossary terms. So, what are the definitions within this particular dashboard? What metrics does it contain? How are they calculated? Who owns those definitions? These may be coming from a spreadsheet that the business owns, and we need to include those in here as well so the users know what they're accessing. And then again, some of it might get added at the publishing time. And again, we'll show an example in a minute of how that might happen, but maybe it's the ownership or additional tags, whatever might be interesting. But the benefit of doing this when we publish it is, as a user now accessing this particular asset, I've got the context around what it is, what it contains, and how I should be using it. And obviously, within a portal like this, if I click into that, I should be able to then access that live report, interact with it, have the necessary context, whether it be those metadata definitions, whether it be the lineage or the tags that we've added to it, to understand what's going on with this particular asset. And what's important is, again, whether that's because I'm looking at a Tableau report or a Power BI dashboard, or whether I'm maybe accessing this spreadsheet that is out there on a file store, there should be the necessary level again of metadata and documentation. And to the user, it's kind of irrelevant that, you know, this is a spreadsheet versus the other one was a Tableau dashboard. It's got the appropriate level of governance to it, so I understand how to use it and you know, how much I can trust it, if you like. The other piece of this is Marius talked about sort of certification of this content. So when content gets published in this way, you'll see sort of this check mark that we show on our assets where, again, it's received, some content has been through a process and has received a level of certification that, you know, again, if it's defined in your organization, users should understand that definition. And so maybe I know that something that's been gold certified has been through a particularly stringent process in terms of checks and balances and, you know, who's been involved with that, and again, who's accountable for it, versus maybe something that has been bronze certified and has had less scrutiny, although has been through a process of checks and balances. And so as a user, you know, the benefit here is, you know, I've got everything in one place, I've got the context behind it, it's organized in a way that makes sense for me, and also gives me then the benefit of being able to search through that content in a much more effective way. So no longer do I have to go to individual tools to look for content and try and find it. I can, you know, search across the body of content that I have access to, utilizing the metadata that we've captured to be able to get a more comprehensive sort of ranked set of results, a Google search style experience, if you like, for your BI that, you know, is benefiting from all that metadata that we've captured as part of the publishing process. So, you know, step one, when you think about, you know, what is a technology solution for having a governed BI environment, is having something like this, having a centralized space where you can remove the complexities of the underlying technology behind the scenes. So if you're going to create this and you're going to create this catalog, you know, the obvious next question is, as you think about the sort of processes to publish something, you know, capturing metadata, certifying the content, you know, to do that in a manual way would be very, very challenging, especially given the again, heterogeneous environment with a lot of different tools and technologies behind the scenes. We want to be able to have some sort of workflow engine that allows us to define a publishing process that is relevant to the content that is going to be included in it. So again, back to the one size doesn't fit all. And one way to think about it, as Marius presented in the slides, is kind of who is involved in that process. Is it just the analyst? Is it, you know, the analyst and the business owner? Does it include the data steward as well? And so being able to define a process that has a number of steps in it, where each of those resources is going to be responsible for reviewing or adding metadata to the asset as it goes through the process, and then finally publishing and certifying that content before it gets added into that centralized catalog that we've been speaking about, with, again, a level of certification. You know, having a way of defining these workflows is important. So that then, you know, as a user responsible for a particular stage in a workflow, I can easily keep track of the assets that I'm responsible for checking and moving forward in the process. So, yeah, an example again might be, you know, for those reports that need a high level of scrutiny, you know, that are going out to the board or the management team or even the street, where there's high consequences if there's issues with them. It may be a fairly involved process that when a particular report is created, it gets added to this queue where it goes through a number of steps. It goes to the analyst who created it, the business owner, maybe the head of finance, the data governance team, where they're each responsible for a stage in the process that involves, yes, reviewing it and making sure it looks good, but also maybe adding in certain metadata, you know, such as a description of the asset, you know, as it comes to the business owner, They may be responsible for tagging it with glossary terms and definitions or adding documentation before, again, it finally goes through the data steward who signs off on it and moves it into that published and certified state. And again, the net result of this is that content is only going to end up in our catalog if it's been through an appropriate process to certify it and check it and make sure it's showing the quality of information that we expect. So again, having a workflow engine of some sort that lets you take the content as it gets created through the checks and balances, whether it's as complex as this or whether it's just the analyst who created it, responsible for that one step of doing everything. It's important to make sure that there is some sort of process to get it out there. So a centralized space, a way of publishing content in there in a certified way. As Marius said as well in the slides, all BI content, all reporting and analytics has a shelf life to it. No report is useful forever. As the business changes, as the way we change things, as technology changes, we change the way we report and we change the way we do dashboarding and analytics. And then therefore it's important to, as we discussed in the slides, have this review and attestation process. And really what that means is, as part of those workflows that we were just looking at, at some point, content is going to come back into some sort of review and attestation stage, where again, it's going to be assigned to someone, someone typically within this flow, where they're responsible for sort of looking at the relevancy of that content still. Is it still useful to the business? Is it still accurate? Is it still relevant to how we measure things? And again, it needs to be automated. There's no way I'm going to keep track of every report that's ever existed in the business and remember to go and check it. The workflow engine that you use has to be able to say, okay, it's this content's been certified for 6 months now. It's pretty high profile. Let's tag it and bring it up for review and get it tested. So how do we know whether a particular report is still relevant and accurate? Well, obviously as the creator of it, maybe I've got some perspective into that, and I've got some perspective in the business. But there's really two other sort of ways that we can measure relevancy. The first is obviously, are people using it? So you need to have a way of, regardless of the content, whether it's a spreadsheet or a BI asset or a data science application and model, we need a way of tracking who is actually using that, wherever they might be using it. Are they receiving a spreadsheet in their email? Are they looking at a Tableau dashboard on their mobile device? Are they consuming a data science application in the portal here? Wherever they're consuming that content, we need to be measuring those views and that engagement so that over time we can get a perspective of how things are trending towards that sell by date. So obviously for the stuff that's most popular in the organization, that's probably a good indication that it's again still being used, therefore still relevant. There's stuff that's been created that's still increasing in popularity, and again a good sign. But there's going to be stuff that is sort of starting to trend off in terms of usage. There's going to be stuff that's going unused, and we need to be acknowledging this and saying, okay, why is that happening? Again, is it because it's become obsolete, or is there an opportunity to revisit this content and maybe improve it, or should we just be retiring it because it's not useful anymore? So usage and getting into the depths of usage, obviously drilling in and being able to see who's using it and which user groups and which technology are those reports created in, all that sort of thing is critical to the level of detail that will give you some perspective. The That's really only one side of the equation. Usage is good, but people might not be using a report, not because they don't want the data, it's just the report is badly designed. Equally, people might be using a report a lot, but it's super frustrating in the way it's designed, and if we improved it, it would be a much better experience for them. So you also want to be collecting more sort of subjective type feedback on content, and having, again, a way of automating the collection of that feedback. So, again, we're back in the portal here looking at a particular dashboard, again, our Tableau one. Well, being able to prompt people down in the bottom right here, for maybe score-based feedback, rate this, how useful is it to you? How likely are you to recommend it? Maybe capturing subjective feedback, and being able to prompt users in a similar way to what you might find on a website, where we're not spamming them every time they come in, but maybe once a month or once a quarter, we'll ask them for their feedback and prompt them for this particular asset, or give them the ability to come in and because they've got some feedback, choose to send it to us. But the point being, if we combine, how often are people using it? What's the engagement? And I'm just looking behind the scenes now at the analysis of that dashboard. We understand how often are people looking at it, and marry that with what feedback are we getting and how they're rating it. We can make a pretty informed decision during that review process to say, okay, this is still relevant, it's obsolete, we should get rid of it, or there's an opportunity to improve this particular asset. So I know we want to leave the remaining time for any questions, but again, in summary, as Marius said, it's not a one-size-fits-all for governance, but it is important to making sure you can increase engagement with your BI, make sure people are interpreting BI in the right way, and keeping it very relevant to the organization. So I will hand it back to see if there's any questions that are coming in.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for that. Before we dive into questions, I do want to remind everyone that now is the time to get straight from the source insight from Marius and Mike. Great questions contribute to a great webinar, so don't forget to submit your questions. I'll make sure to answer them during these last 13 minutes that we have here. All righty, moving on to audience questions. This first one comes in from Amol, and excuse me, I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong. This audience member says, in a self-service/hybrid model where the BI team handles more visible enterprise items and enable departments to self-serve a lot of their own needs, what's the best practice for governance on the self-service side of things?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think it's very common, especially in large-scale enterprises, to be able to have a situation where there isn't a central team that's going to be able to onboard all the content. That would be sort of ridiculous, right, at scale, if you've got thousands or even tens of thousands of assets across the entire enterprise, and yet you still need to have some kind of a governance model, right? And so what we recommend for that kind of an experience is sort of a hub and spoke type of model, where essentially what you have is a COE team, a centralized team that is responsible for setting the governance practices from a BI governance perspective. And so they would be doing things like in that portal that Mike defined, they would be defining the categories, they would be defining the general high-level workflows that are there. And then you designate the actual onboarding of content, you federate that out to the source, right, to the people that are going to be actually onboarding that content. So it can be a self-service experience. So if somebody's creating content, they have the ability to publish that content into the portal in specific areas, following a simple workflow we just talked about. And there can be, Mike didn't get a chance to get into it in too much detail, but there can be all kinds of synchronization that happens automatically. So when an asset is, let's say, placed in a particular place in a Tableau folder or a Power BI workspace, it automatically gets promoted into a staging area within the portal. And then all you have to do is go to that area, check a few buttons at the description, and then it gets published, right? So you can make it super lightweight. weight, but it is very important to have some layer of governance, even in a distributed self-service model, because otherwise you've just got chaos, right? People are gonna, self-service is fine if I'm just going to get things for myself, but as soon as I'm publishing things for other people, now I better make sure that the criteria that I use to look at this is going to be consistent. And of course, the tools that I use for my self-service also should be published into the government environment in a way that I know from a data literacy perspective, what am I looking at, what definitions are in place, etc. So it's important to still follow a process, but you can delegate it out so that you don't have to kind of put this burden on a single centralized team to do the entire publishing.
And I think the key point you made there as well, Marius, is kind of what do we mean by self-service, right? If I'm truly just using content for myself, well, likely we do not need a governance process around that, right? It's where I'm, even if it's just with a couple of other people, I'm starting to share that out. There needs to be some checks and balances, and I think it's kind of, people talk about sort of democratizing data and encouraging self-service, and the irony is, to do that well, you need to sort of control it, because otherwise, it's the Wild West out there. So in order to have effective self-service, you need control and governance behind the scenes to make it happen.
Yeah, that's very true. Good point.
That is a fantastic answer. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Amol, for giving us that question there. If you need any clarification, go ahead and get that into the chat, and I'll make sure to get to it with these last 9 minutes that we have. Moving on to our next question, and this one's coming in from Emily. Emily wants to know, can you provide some suggestions for how to best start the process of BI governance?
So I would say kind of, you want to almost follow that sequence that I give you. You don't start with technology. We're technology providers, but we should be clear kind of out of the gate. You really want to start with understanding the people process aspect of it first, right? So kind of defining your governance objectives as a whole, figuring out like what is even initially kind of doing a little bit of a level setting on your current state. And then if you need to, sometimes you have to start with getting a justification, right? So it depends on like, do you have a team already that can do the governance or not? But assuming that you have the team already in place to do the governance, and you're like, well, what are the first steps that I want to take? Well, I think that it's really defining short, medium, long-term goals that you want from a governance perspective. Figuring out what are the measures you're going to have to move that you can hold from a metrics perspective to hold yourself accountable to being successful, and then going from there, doing that process piece to think about, okay, what are the things that are governing? What process are we going to use? Generally speaking, where are we going to, how are we going to apply that process? And then fitting the technology to that solution, right? So the technology is very important, but it comes as an enabler of the process that you've defined, and the process needs to be lined up with the overall level of goals and objectives that are there. So I realize that's kind of a 10,000 foot type of answer, but I would follow that sort of a methodology to get to the bottom of it. Mike, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think setting some goals is important as well, right? So to your point, typically why are people doing this? Well, they want to get people using BI in a more effective way in the organization. Yes, there's probably some compliance and security things that you need to be checking the box on, but ultimately we're trying to drive engagement here. And so, having that as a measure for how things are going is a good way to sort of track progress as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also it's a good way to motivate the organization as a whole towards, moving in this direction, because that's often a big challenge. I find often, the governance team is this little small team in an organization, and yet governance is something that for it to work, it needs to be everyone's responsibility, right? So you've got to be able to communicate to the rest of the organization what the goals are and the end state that you're going to, and what the benefits are going to be, and in a way that's compelling, that's going to get those folks that are self-serving to help you with pieces that you're going to need the assistance from them on. So what Mike just said, really coming up with, well, where are we now? What are the things that we want to improve? And then explaining that in a way that's very clear to people in the organization is super important.
Thank you guys again for another fantastic answer there. Moving on, because we do have a couple more questions before we close out. This one is coming in from James. James asks, how long does a typical deployment take? What's the range?
Take that, Marius.
I can take that. Yeah. So for us, it really, I hate to say it, it depends kind of answer because it depends on the scale of it. But to give you a general range, you know, once you're getting to a point where you have the technology and you know what you want to do, then the deployment of the actual technology is anything between kind of a 30, 60, 90-day process. So if something very simple might be deployable in about 30 days, a kind of a larger scale type of implementation. Again, you would want to phase things out. You're not going to boil ocean on this kind of thing. You want to deploy it iteratively, but a more complex initial deployment with lots of data sources, lots of connectors, maybe some different process challenges. You might look at 90 days before from the time you have the software available, the infrastructure in place, and you're ready to get started. A lot of the time spent, at least, you know, in doing these kind of deployments is really thinking through, you know, what is the solution design going to look like? What do you want the user experience to be? Which assets are you going to bring in? Where's the metadata going to come from those assets? So it's not really, most of the work is not actually in doing the onboarding of the content into the portal. It is really in planning that onboarding and thinking through all the details and figuring out how is making sure that you have a coherent experience that aligns with the goals that you're trying to achieve. And that's what takes most of the time. Mike, would you add anything to that?
It's kind of cliche, but really it's, you know, you're changing the way you do things, right? And so to Marius's point, you're defining a process that then becomes the way that you work, right? That yes, the technology is then implemented to support that, but then it's an ongoing process, right? So it's kind of never ending from that perspective. But yeah, it's about getting a process that works for the types of content that you have and the sort of personas that you're serving that content to. And you know, once you've defined that, then you know the implementation of that is an ongoing thing.
Yeah, that's a great call out. Like that 60 days, or 90 days, you might have that first group up, and then you've got to iterate other lines of business or other groups or things of that nature. So
and then you're coming back and revisiting the content, as we said. So it's really a change in the way that you work versus, you know, sort of, you know, short implementation to get something done and, you know, governance is finished sort of thing, right? It's an ongoing thing.
Another fantastic answer there. I believe we have time for just one more question. This next one, what is the best way to get executive buy-in for a BI governance initiative? I will pass this over to you, Marius.
So I think you kind of going back to what Mike said before, it's really important to tie to specific goals, to have specific goals in mind, right? So oftentimes, like if you try to talk to any executives about governance, you're kind of like, you about 2 or 3 sentences in, you'll start seeing their eyes gloss over, right? Because that's not like something that's top of mind for them. They're trying to drive revenue, reduce costs, blah, blah, blah. So you've got to tie it into something that's meaningful to them. And that could be things like, hey, look, we've benchmarked our usage of our BI platform, and half of the user community is not using our analytics at all. Or we have, you know, we're spending X amount of dollars on our BI infrastructure, and look, only 50% of the community, only all these licenses are going unused, right? We've given them to people that are not using them, or we've created all these assets of which only a small percentage are being used. So translating that into a, hey, you know, there's actual missed opportunity here from a perspective of wasted effort that's going towards nowhere, right? One area from an ROI perspective, and then the second part of it is like impact opportunity as far as the ability to use analytics to really inform decision making that's going by the wayside just because you have a ungoverned space where people don't know where to turn to find the analytics, don't know which analytic they should use, don't understand from a data literacy perspective what they should be interpreting from that information. So it's like the idea is to use governance not as a means to an end of achieving higher efficiency, translating that into specific metrics and goals in that area. Of course, first benchmarking where you are and do that. And if you do that, then you can get executive attention, because that usually is an area they can relate to and understand, and you're promising to move the needle in a real way for them. Mike, would you add anything to that?
I think my only thing I would add as well is I think, you know, if like a lot of organizations, reality is there's quite a lot of frustration with BI in terms of, everyone wants BI, but everyone's frustrated with BI just because it's complex and there's so much out there, and there's always discussions about data and, is it right? And a lot of time wasted on that. Making it personal as well, right? If the exec team is frustrated with data, translating the fact that actually governance just isn't about compliance, it's about getting them better data and more trustworthy information. Yes, that's not quantifiable, but that should ring true to their experiences.
And with that fantastic answer, that is all the time that we have for today. I hope everyone had as much fun as I did and learned as much as I did. Thanks to our sponsor, Metric Insights, and a huge special thank you to you, Mike, and to you, Marius, for taking the time to give us such insightful session and answer our burning questions.
Thank you so much.
Awesome, and another big thank you to Metric Insights. I hope you guys all have an enjoyable Wednesday and enjoy the rest of your week.